This is Behind the Verdict. I'm John Horford with Myrene Cook. And today we're going to dive into a new case. We're going to be talking about the Menéndez brothers. Before we get into it, we just want to give an overview of the case for those of you who aren't aware or who just need a refresher. So, the Menéndez Brothers Case is one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history, known for its shocking details of murder, family dysfunction, and intense media scrutiny.
Eric and Lyle Menéndez, born in 1970 and 1968 respectively, were the sons of Jose and Kitty Menéndez, a wealthy couple living in Beverly Hills, California. Jose Menéndez was a successful entertainment executive, while Kitty was a homemaker. The family appeared outwardly affluent and successful, but was later revealed to have deep internal dysfunction.
On the evening of August 20th, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menéndez were shot to death in their Beverly Hills home. The brothers initially called 911, claiming to have found their parents murdered. They appeared distraught and cooperated with police in the early stages of the investigation.
However, suspicion grew as Eric and Lyle began spending extravagantly in the weeks following the murders, using their inheritance to buy luxury items and purchase lavish lifestyles. After months of investigation, Eric confessed to a therapist about the murders, who later informed the police. After legal complications involving patient confidentiality were sorted out, both brothers were arrested in 1990.
The first trial began in 1993 and drew immense public attention, partly due to the live broadcast of the proceedings. The brothers admitted to killing their parents, but claimed that it was in self-defense, alleging years of severe physical, emotional, and sexual abuse by their father. They also described their mother as complicit and neglectful.
The prosecution argued that the murders were premeditated and motivated by greed, pointing to the brothers' financial troubles and inheritance as motives. The first trial ended in 2 hung juries, with jurors split over the decision. In the second trial, in 1995 through 1996, different evidentiary rulings limited the defense's ability to present evidence of abuse. Both brothers were ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
The case became a cultural phenomenon, sparking debates about family violence, abuse, and the justice system. Critics argued that the brothers' claims of abuse were either exaggerated or fabricated, while others believed their allegations should have been a mitigating factor in sentencing.
The case has been the subject of multiple documentaries, books, and dramatizations, reflecting its enduring public fascination. In recent years, advocates have called for a review of the brothers' sentences, citing increased awareness of the impact of abuse and trauma on behavior. However, their convictions and sentences at this point remain upheld.
The Menéndez Brothers case continues to resonate as a stark example of how family dynamics can lead to devastating outcomes, raising complex questions about justice, trauma, and accountability. Now, before we dive into it, I'm going to preface this episode by saying that you have an opinion of this case that could potentially upset some people. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say that I have an opinion that may not be popular with everyone.
I guess either way you go on this case, that could be said. But I wanted to say that, and then I also wanted you to bring up the bracelets before we got into it, just so people understand where you're coming from. And if you've listened to the previous episodes, because it's also possible that people are just jumping in to listen to this episode. Myrene is a prosecutor. She has years and years, over 20 years of experience.
Close to 25.
Almost 25 years of experience. She was the prosecutor in the Andrea Bowman case. You've dedicated your life to protecting children and getting justice for victims.
Exactly. I'm one of those prosecutors who tries to give the victims a voice when they either cannot speak for themselves or cannot find the strength initially to do it. I'm a prosecutor who believes in justice in one who believes victims when they say things have happened. And then the investigations look for corroboration to those statements, to those disclosures about things that have happened. I am basically one of those prosecutors who has specialized in cases involving child sexual assault for, 15, 20 years at this point. I work with children's assessment centers. I teach forensic interviewing, which is the tool investigators use to interview and question victims on cases like this. So I have an immense background in all of this. That being said, I am also a prosecutor who is willing to try cases. If I believe in the credibility of the victim, I will try that case, knowing we might not get a conviction, but at the end of the day, the victim will know that I believed them, our team believed them, and sometimes that's what a victim needs to have healing. So we will try cases, and I think it's important to note that victims come first in my book. They always have, and they always will. You mentioned this bracelet circumstance. So I have this little bracelet. It's very sentimental to me. It's a string bracelet that was given to me by a victim of a crime that I helped on. This victim needed my help to find their own strength, and they ultimately found it so incredibly well. But this victim, after the case was done, after the perpetrator was sentenced, gave me a thank you card that was handmade with a bracelet that was the same color of the jacket that I wore the day in sentencing, and said that I gave this person the strength to continue and the strength to move forward on their case, and they couldn't have done it without me. So I wear this bracelet every single day. I'm not kidding, every single day. I've just moved. I can't find all the rest of my jewelry, but I know exactly where this bracelet was because I take it off at night and put it right back on in the morning. And so what this bracelet is to me is a symbol of why I do what I do, to do the right thing for the right reason. And if you believe the right thing is to support those disclosures, that victim, to prosecute that case, then I'm absolutely going to do it every single time. So I want our listeners to understand and know I do have a very extensive background in these types of cases, and I am a prosecutor who will move forward even with the hardest of circumstances to find that justice for the victims when I believe it's credible.
So not only do you have a background in these types of cases, you have a heart for this, like genuinely. So with that in mind, you have an opinion of this case related to the sexual abuse of the Menéndez brothers that is the opposite of, what some of the, media outlets are starting to put out. And that's another thing we've talked about in past episodes, the effect of the media on the way that people perceive these cases. Based on all of your experience and your knowledge, almost 25 years protecting victims, you have mentioned that you do not believe that the Menéndez brothers were sexually abused by their father. Why is that?
That's correct. So in looking back at this just for a moment, I was just starting college when this crime happened in August of 1989. But I remember following it on TV. This was one of the first cases, I think, that was followed immensely by court TV during the first trials. And so I was able to watch that quite a bit. I knew I wanted to be an attorney. I knew I wanted to, have that type of job where I could argue. I didn't know yet that I wanted to be the voice for those who can't speak for themselves. That came later. But I followed it a lot, and I researched it over the years. And then when the second trial happened, I looked at the differences, and I researched that a lot. And I've looked at everything since then, including the new push for resentencing. And I really think it's important to remind our listeners and everyone else of a couple things. Number one, the original prosecutor in the first trial has come forward and came forward at the time of the trial and said she did not believe the abuse allegations at all.
What reasons did she give for that?
She said she saw no evidence of it. There was nothing to corroborate it. And in fact, the evidence on the other side of the coin was overwhelming about the greed with regard to the inheritance and everything else that the prosecution was focusing on. And so I think we really need to give some deference to the prosecutors who handled this case. Just like I've said in prior episodes, we've talked about the surface level of the Andrea Bowman murder and the Kathleen Doyle homicide as well by the same murderer. We've talked about details, but there's no way that we can take a podcast and I can tell you as the prosecutor on the Bowman case, every single solitary detail, piece of evidence, everything I looked at, every witness statement, every confession, every behavior, every telltale sign, red flag, whatever you'd like to call it. I can't tell you all of that in the media. The media doesn't focus on that. The media focuses on, generally, what's going to be their best soundbite, right? They want to have people listen. They want to have people watch. They want to have people tune in. And so that's what they focus on more often than not. And so I do, as a prosecutor, give deference to the prosecutors who handled this case, both in the first trial and the second, and understand they know things that the rest of us have absolutely no idea about.
Are there what specific details about the case, besides just giving deference to the prosecutor, what specific details make you think that they were not sexually abused? You have an extensive experience in this space. You've given the forensic interviews, right?
Yes.
You teach people how to do it. What's missing here? Why do you not believe that they were abused?
I remember watching the trial and the clips from the trial and them testifying, the Menéndez brothers testifying in the first trial. And my gut, something just didn't sit right in my gut. Like I didn't believe it then. And I didn't have the experience I have now. In looking at it now, in hindsight, I still have that feeling in my gut, something is off, something is not right. So I looked at a lot of details about what the prosecutors said. And they went back and looked at how many hours a day the Menéndez brothers were spending with their respective lawyers, because they each had one. They were spending 4 or 5 hours a day for 2 years to prepare for that trial. And one of the things one of those prosecutors said is that many hours a day times that many weeks times that many years, anybody could be prepared with any kind of statement they want to give and flip any kind of story they'd like. So that's part of it. Another part is that there have been family members recently who've come out both for the Menéndez brothers and against resentencing them. And so I've looked at both sides to see what they say. But one of the things that struck me and sticks out is how the brother, and I forget his first name, his last name is Anderson, the brother of Kitty Menéndez, has come out and said he doesn't believe the abuse either. And he was close. Their families were close. He doesn't believe his sister did any of that. He doesn't believe Jose did any of that. He believes it was based on greed. He had firsthand knowledge that Jose was changing his will and either limiting or taking the boys out of the will. For whatever their reasons were, that was happening.
And they knew that was happening?
That is what the brother, who is the Menéndez brothers' uncle, that is what he says.
Yeah.
That they knew this was happening.
But there's no proof that they knew that it was happening. But this family member said that there are conversations, and if he knew, that they likely knew as well.
My understanding is there were some allegations that Lyle had gone onto his father's computer shortly after the murders to try to delete this potential new will. Whether or not he was successful, I'm not sure. I haven't been able to find any details on that piece of it. So there's that as a red flag to me. Another red flag to me is when Eric initially confessed they were the ones who killed their parents to the therapist. And then Lyle came into those conversations with Eric and the therapist. They never told the therapist about this abuse. If you're going to talk about sexual abuse allegations, doesn't it seem logical? Doesn't it seem like the place you might do that is in the safety and security of a therapist office who is bound by confidentiality, patient-doctor privilege, all of these different types of things? They didn't mention that.
Have you had cases in the past, because you've worked on, hundreds and hundreds of cases, have you had cases in the past where a victim wasn't comfortable talking with a therapist about being sexually abused?
More often than not, they're going to be more comfortable talking with a therapist, in my experience, than with anyone else because they know those things. They know that the therapist is there to help them. They can help process it if they trust the therapist. And it sounds like at least Eric did.
One of them admitted to murder to the therapist, correct?
Eric did.
Okay.
Eric did initially.
Yeah.
And then he called Lyle and said, this is what I did. And basically, from what I recall, Lyle blew a gasket, went down there to meet with the therapist and Eric as well. But neither of them said anything about the abuse to the therapist. So
you think it's strange that they would admit to, at least one of them would admit to murder, but not to the sexual abuse to the therapist?
Exactly. I think what they said was they were embarrassed by it, and that is a legitimate response. Victims are often embarrassed. They think people will think less of them. But you just admitted to this therapist a murder. I don't know, what more you're going to be embarrassed by.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the culture could end up playing a part. I mean, just being Hispanic, I feel like, murder, as crazy as this sounds, is more of like, it seems more like manly and not emasculating, but admitting to being sexually abused could be emasculating. And I'm also saying that as someone who is, I don't look it, but I'm Hispanic and Black. But yeah, so I just know from the culture that, that could be a factor. But to your point, it does seem strange knowing that the therapist is bound by all of these laws, all these confidentiality laws. It is strange that they would admit to, or at least the one brother would admit to murder, but not to being sexually abused.
And I take into consideration the cultural aspects of it, even the sense that they were males, right? That's been made a big piece in the media. I've heard people say, well, if these were the Menéndez sisters, they never would have been convicted, which I don't necessarily agree with that either. So there may have been a lot of reasons why they didn't want to talk about it if indeed it happened. But my concern as a prosecutor is I'm seeing too many red flags to believe it right off the bat just because they said it. There's too many.
What other red flags are you seeing?
In addition to the therapist, when the therapist said, okay, well, why did you kill your mom? And the statement was made to put her out of her misery because she wouldn't be able to live without him. Again, that's kind of an odd thing to say. And then when you look at the brutality of what they did and how they did it, they didn't just walk into that TV room in their mansion and shoot their dad one time and their mom one time. They shot them multiple times each. I want to say Jose was shot somewhere between 5 and 6 times, one at close range to the back of his head.
You think that was probably the first shot?
They walked in behind him, so it might have been.
Yeah.
Or if they came around the front, maybe not. But Kitty was shot, I want to say more like 10 times. And at one point, she was either trying to crawl or walk away or trying to get away to safety, and they were out of ammo. So I believe it was Lyle who went outside to their car, got more ammunition, came back in, and shot his mother in the face. Shot her in the cheek, and they believe that was the final shot. So the brutality of what they did was something too.
Why do you think they were so much brutal when it came? It seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like they were so much more brutal when it came to the murder of their mother. Why is that? Is it because she didn't protect them? Is it because, what factor could have led to that, in your opinion?
Well, at one point, I think it was Lyle who said, well, the mom sexually abused him too, and then didn't talk about that quite as much, but went into more detail about it later. And who knows if that was accurate or not. I know that when the Menéndez family came forward on behalf of Lyle and Eric, they didn't talk about the alleged allegations against Kitty. They only talked about the alleged allegations against Jose. And again, Kitty's brother says he doesn't believe either of them happened. I think another red flag is the behavior the brothers had directly after the murders. They went on very extravagant spending sprees. Now, I'm not wealthy like the Menéndez family by any stretch. And some people may say that going out and buying a Rolex watch is in the normal course of business for somebody who is very affluent. But I believe they bought 3 or 4 Rolex watches. They bought new suits. They bought different kinds of things. Initially, they were trying to say that their dad, Jose, dealt with some very bad men, and maybe it was some sort of hit, like a contract hit by the mob or mafia or other bad characters. And so the company that Jose worked for actually provided a limousine with security, 2 security guards, to take the boys wherever they wanted to go. But that wasn't good enough. They wanted a limousine and 2 security guards each. So they each could go different places in a limo and have security. So their behavior after was just very extravagant. And when you try to think of the reason that we hear from the uncle, which was monetary or financially motivated, it kind of goes hand in hand with their behavior afterwards.
So you don't think that that could just be a trauma response? I mean, they knew, obviously people at the time didn't know that they were the ones who had committed these murders. They knew they had committed these murders, but do they justify it in their own minds by saying, we were sexually abused for so long, we deserve this?
It doesn't seem like the boys were financially strapped before these murders. They lived very affluent lifestyles. Lyle had gone to, I want to say it was Princeton University. Eric was signed up to go to another university. They both had tennis lessons and were in tennis contests and different kinds of things. They had very nice vehicles, other types of things. They lived in a beautiful multi-million-dollar mansion. So it doesn't seem like their lives were strapped for cash before these murders.
So you think that that's not a trauma response that someone would have if they were sexually abused?
It could be a trauma response. And so the difficulty I'm having is I'm seeing too many red flags all at once with all of it, with their disclosures, with their statements, with how things happened, with what family members who had inside knowledge say, with what prosecutors who had inside knowledge say. That's very difficult. You know, another interesting point to me was that I believe it was Lyle did not testify at the subsequent trial. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
He had some conversations that were recorded, I want to say with a reporter or an author, someone who was going to write a book. And in those recordings, it made him, in his defense attorney's mind, less than credible because he talked about things. He asked people at times to lie or come forward with a different story or to say something that didn't happen did. And so his credibility was shot by the second trial. That's why he didn't testify.
So what would you say to people who bring up the abuse allegations that the member of Menudo came forward with against Jose?
So there were 2 things when this idea of resentencing the Menéndez brothers came out. 2 pieces of evidence that family members asked the prosecutors to look at in deciding whether or not to resentence. The first actually was a letter that allegedly Eric had written a cousin that said something to the effect of, this abuse is still ongoing or it's still happening to me. And I can't recall off the top of my head exactly when that was written in conjunction with the murders themselves. But that's a little bit of a red flag. That only comes out now, 34 years later. This cousin didn't come forward with that letter during the trials that I know of. If they did, then I am not aware of it. And why would they keep this letter that long? I mean, if you think back to letters and things you thought you wanted to keep when you were a teenager, do you still have all of those?
Yeah, I mean, probably not.
I mean, I don't. And at the time, you may not know the magnitude of what that might equate to someday. So it's a little odd that it resurfaced now. Your direct question was about the member of the band Menudo who came forward and said that Jose had sexually abused him.
Yes.
That, on the other hand, is something that is not a red flag to me. That is something that would go in the favor of there being abuse, because now you have a completely independent person coming forward and saying, this happened to me as well. So you could look at that and say, well, Jose Menéndez may have had a propensity to do these things to young boys, and maybe that's the case. But based on all of that other evidence, on the behavior, on the testimony, it just didn't sit credibly with me. It just didn't.
And even if that was the case, if he did sexually abuse his sons, and this member of Menudo, and had a propensity for, assaulting young boys, is that justification for releasing two violent murderers from prison? Because that's what a lot of people are saying. They're saying that the Menéndez brothers were traumatized, they were sexually assaulted, and they should be released from prison.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. And, I think you have to look at the heinous nature of what they did. And we talked about that a little bit. And we talked about their behavior both before and after the murders themselves. But I don't think it's a reason necessarily to release them. Is it something that should have been a mitigating factor at their sentencing? Absolutely. And you know what? I think it was, because California had the death penalty. So they could have decided to sentence them to the death penalty for these murders. But that wasn't decided. So as a prosecutor, when I look at that, a mitigating factor was they were spared that potential penalty and given life without the possibility of parole, and that seems reasonable. Now, if you do believe that they were sexually assaulted, these boys were, and I don't want to say boys because you know what, quite honestly,
Young
they were men. They were
Yeah.
young men. They were 18 and 21 years old when this happened. They could have left home. Now, would they have had the money that they were used to? No, probably not. But they were young, healthy, strong-looking young men who could have left the home, got a job, waiting tables, or any other kind of job they could find.
Princeton educated, could have probably
They
gotten a decent
could have-
job.
Yeah, they
At
probably
least the
could
one
have.
brother.
I don't know if he graduated. Maybe
Okay.
he did, but they could have gotten away. They could have left that home, but they chose not to. Now, again, I look at that and say, well, there are times victims don't think they have an option. They think that's where they're stuck. They think that's where they belong, and maybe that's the case. But as a prosecutor who is willing to try those hard cases, who's willing to give credibility to victims, I have to also go with my gut feeling. And from the very beginning until now, I don't know that I believe everything they're saying. The flip side of that is with the band member coming out, maybe there is some credibility to it. And I'm not saying there's not. I'm saying I'm not convinced yet.
And you're the type of person, if the evidence is there, if it's convincing, you're with the victim.
Absolutely, 100%. If the evidence is there, if I don't have so many of these red flags all at once, and I have a lot of them in this case, I am absolutely 100% on the side of championing the victim's voice, of being their voice, giving them strength, and pursuing justice for them. I just have a lot of questions and red flags. But again, I go back to, we're not the prosecutors on this case. We don't have all of the evidence to look at and all of the witness statements and, quite honestly, the knowledge that these prosecutors had when they did this case.
Are there any additional red flags you want to touch on before we wrap up the episode?
Not that I can think of today, but quite honestly, John, I'm interested in what your opinion is. What do you think?
I don't know. Genuinely. I think these cases are difficult. I think a lot of these cases are difficult. You look at the evidence, it's compelling. The one thing that I can't get over, and it just keeps replaying in my mind, is how violent they were towards their mother. I can't let that go. Why? Like, they shot her more. She was alive, tried to get away, went outside, got more ammunition, came back in, shot her more, including like right in the face. you have to hate someone so deeply to do that, or you have to be so evil to do that. It's difficult for me to wrap my mind around them. Like, why do they hate her so much? Like, everything seems to be pointed towards the father, whether it's the sexual abuse, whether that happened or didn't happen, father, removal of the will, whether it happened or didn't happen, connected to the father. So why so violent towards your mother?
Yeah, that's a weird one to answer. I thought of another red flag that I didn't share, and I read something that was written in part by some of the transport deputies when they transported Eric and Lyle to the trials from the jail when they were in. And they said if they had a day that seemed good for them in court, when the boys left the courtroom, they would high five each other. That doesn't seem like something you would high five about.
No.
You're talking about this alleged abuse. You're talking about these horrible things your parents did to you, and poor us, how abused we are. And then, according to these reports of security, they were high-fiving each other. That just doesn't sit right with me.
That doesn't sit right with me either. And then, obviously, just knowing your experience, hearing about what the prosecutor, the first prosecutor in the case had said initially, it's hard to believe that there isn't something more going on here. And I'm not saying that there wasn't some type of abuse or what we would consider abuse. Like back in the 80s, I mean, spanking your kid, hitting your kid, I feel like those were pretty commonplace. So there could have been that. I mean, and now we would consider that abuse in a lot of cases, correct?
Yeah, and that's changed a lot. Corporal punishment is looked at very, very differently.
Yeah.
In one of the reports I read, it said that Lyle admitted he was sexually abused between the ages of 6 and 8, but that his father hadn't touched him since he was about 8 years old. Eric, on the other hand, said that it happened when he was younger and it was continuing until, present day before the murders kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I don't think the media focused on that Lyle was abused as a child and it wasn't ongoing. The media's made it sound like it was ongoing abuse for both of them, didn't it?
And you're saying that's not the case from what you've read?
Not so far.
I guess I was bringing up the abuse, like the hitting of the kids, the spanking of the kids, however you want to describe it, just to say that some level of abuse could have occurred. Maybe it wasn't the sexual abuse that they're claiming, and they still were able to justify, experiencing that in their head as a reason for killing both of their parents. But the death of the mother, Kitty, that is what really keeps me from, leaning towards them towards them being sexually abused. Like, there's just something very, very sinister about that in my mind.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think it was very brutal. And, the weapon of choice here were shotguns. These weren't pistols. This wasn't quick. I mean, these were shotguns. And the blasts to some of the areas of the victims left gaping holes, especially the one to the back of Jose's head. And so you think of that, it takes a very brutal, very sinister, very evil thought to put that gun to the back of someone's head and pull that trigger.
And then to relive all of that during court, plus the abuse that you're claiming, and then to be high-fiving.
Right. So you see what I'm saying is I'm not saying 100% they weren't abused. Although the original prosecutor said she's 100% certain. She said, I'm not 90%, I am 100% certain.
That's damning.
There was no abuse.
Yeah.
And, I give deference to that. I really do as a prosecutor. I hate to repeat myself, but she saw everything. She saw all the evidence, and she doesn't buy it, not one bit. So I give some leaning toward that, right? But I read another article that said if it was their maid or a chef or someone who worked for the family, indicated that the boys treated the parents horrifically. And if the parents tried to limit their spending, which they tried to do more often than not, the boys absolutely went off on the parents. So I don't know if people like that testified during the trial for sure or not. I think that's something I want to look into a little bit more, like who was on the witness list. I think would be really interesting to see and kind of talk about that. But there's just too many red flags for me right off the bat to say, yeah, I believe they were fully abused, whether it was sexual or physical or emotional or a combination. There's just a lot of red flags for me.
We'll continue looking into some of these details. We'd like to base our next episode on this around a lot of the questions that you all may have. So please, if you have any questions, we would love to hear from you. Message us on our Instagram page, BTV_pod. And additionally, if you're enjoying the podcast, please rate us, leave us a message.
And if you agree or disagree with some of the red flags we've talked about, let us know. We'd like to know your opinion on those as well. But keep us in mind, listen to us at Behind the Verdict, and leave the comments.
You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.